Good morning to everybody. My name is Andrius Kubilius, and I am happy to start our event, which is organized by Informal Forum of the Friends of European Russia, which we created in European Parliament, and also French Association Russie-Libertés, in cooperation with the Embassy of the Republic of Lithuania in France. And the whole event is devoted to the topic, how can EU-Russia relations contribute to strengthening civil society in Russia? And that is where I will ask now our moderator, Mrs. Rim Momtaz, to take the floor, and we shall start our really very important discussion, and I will try then to make my comments why this discussion is so important. So, Mrs. Rim, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kubilius, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Rim Momtaz. I'm the senior correspondent for Politico in France, and I'm delighted to be moderating this panel with some extremely special guests with us today. We will have a series of opening remarks first, and then we will jump into a discussion which I'm sure will be extremely lively, and it is a very timely, obviously, conversation given the events over the weekend in Russia. And I wanted to just do a bit of housekeeping first. Please do not hesitate to submit your questions to us through the chat. I will be more than happy to relay them to our esteemed panel. I will give back the floor just now to Mr. Kubilius for some perhaps opening remarks, after whom we'll give the floor to Mr. Kobyakov as well as co-organizers. Back to you, Andreas.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Mrs. Rim. Really, again, it's a pleasure and honor for me to make some comments on the opening of this seminar. Those who were following our activities, you have seen that starting from 2019, we established in European Parliament informal forum, which we called Forum of the Friends of European Russia, and where we discussed all the different issues connected with developments in Russia, with, main question, how to assist Russia in transforming itself back to democracy. And that is where we really were always very proud to have our good friends from Russia, like Vladimir Karamurza, whom we have today. And happy to see you not in jail somewhere, in Moscow, but present in our meeting. We see Vladimir Milov, with whom we had a lot of discussions, and everybody knows that he's very close ally to Aleksei Navalny. We have Aleksei Navalny in our meetings. So that is where really our forum was trying to bring the knowledge of what is happening in Russia towards European Parliament, in order really to see how we can assist civil society in Russia and how we can assist the most important strategic goal, really to assist Russia to come back to democracy. Is it possible to have such a transformation? Several years ago, I saw that really in big capitals of Europe, there was a lot of doubts about such a possibility. But since recent events, since events in Belarus, since events in Russia itself, after poisoning and arrest of Aleksei Navalny, I am much more sure that even during my lifetime, I am still considering myself quite young, despite the fact that I am in 60s. So I hope that I will see that transformation. There are a lot of reasons why I am so optimistic. But besides that, I would say that this is also, our major strategic goal. I did not introduce myself. I am from Lithuania, from the neighborhood of Russia. I was in Lithuanian politics till 2019. I was Prime Minister of Lithuania, and so on and so on. But when I am looking really into what is our major strategic goal, asking ourselves what would improve our geopolitical security, of course, transformation in our neighborhood towards democracy, that is the most important, important development, which we would be very happy to see. And that is why we are working in European Parliament on those topics. So discussions on what kind of EU policy towards Russia should be, established are becoming very hot topics, not only in the Council, but also in European Parliament. I became also standing rapporteur on Russia. And we are preparing a report, and we hope that this report will come out before Duma elections in September. I think that Duma elections in Russia are really most important event of this year. We can predict that Mr. Putin will follow Lukashenko example, trying really very brutally to suppress all the possibility for for people in Russia to have a free choice. And that is where the question comes back to us. How and in which way we're ready to defend the right of civil society in Russia, the right of Russian people to have a possibility to make a decision on the changes that they want to do. So we really saw also that it would be very important to have those discussions which we have had, as I said, in European Parliament, where really I was very happy that my good friend Bernard Guetta always was really very active in all those discussions. We started to think how to bring those discussions also to capitals of European Union, and especially to big capitals like Paris, which is really playing very important and most important role in developing this future policy towards Russia. And that is why I really am happy that we have such a panel today, both with representatives of democratic Russia and also representatives of French political community, experts, and all other people. And I really wish all of us to have good debates. And thanks a lot, Mrs. Rim, for your guidance of us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I'm going to cede the floor now to Mr. Nikolai Kobliakov, who's the president of the Association Russie-Libertés.
Okay, thank you for floor. I will take not more than 5 minutes, I hope. And first of all, I want to express my deep gratitude for the Lithuanian Embassy, personally for Mr. Aleksei Navalny, and definitely for Andrius Kubilius for this wonderful opportunity. So I would start with a couple of words about Russie-Libertés, and then we'll come closer to the main aim of today's webinar. So Russie-Libertés is not a very big association, but we are active since 2012, when the first protests have shown in Russia that civil society actually existed. Since that time, the most important that we succeeded to keep our organization. With help of our friends, definitely Marie Mandras, Sergei Guriev, and Andrei Gatolin, we made, I think, a lot. So during these 7 years, we published at least one book that was Coup de Coeur en FNAC about the other faces in Russia. We represented in National Assembly of France the reports about the war in Ukraine, about corruption, about the rights of women in Russia. And I would say that approximately about half of all the manifestations in front of Russian embassy in Paris, they are declared by our association also. So we are happy that we are not political association, we are association of civil activism, so we don't support any political power, nor in Europe, neither in Russia, but definitely we support the basic democratic values, and we are trying to inform French society about the real situation of democracy in Russia. So the main idea of today's webinar is to understand how the strengthening of relations between EU and civil society of Russia can help to Russia. So what I want to address your attention for, first of all, it was very nice news that European Union has imposed these sanctions against 4 Russian executives that were involved into that process of arrestation of Aleksei Navalny. And we really hope that it's only the first step, because as you remember that the team of Aleksei Navalny, Volkov and Ashurkov, they presented initially that list that was slightly longer, I would say. So why it's very important? Because the fact for Russian civil society that European Parliament, that European community is active in this area gives hope that the war is not lost, that civil society can exist, and altogether we can actually change the situation in Russia. From another point of view, it's very important to impose the policy of red lines, that definitely Europe needs cooperation with Russia, but several red lines should exist. So for instance, we are not able to sleep safe while Alexei is in prison, because never mind if somebody does not share his political position expressed several years ago, we should understand that by keeping him in prison, Russian government actually violates not only real values, democratic, but direct decisions of European Court. Okay, but from another point of view, what I really want to address your attention to, that red lines, they exist from both sides. So from first side, European community should not cross the red lines in cooperation with Russia, but from another point of view, definitely European Commission cannot put enormous sanctions against Russia that will diminish seriously the level of life of Russian people. And it's very important to understand that that's, from our point of view, the role of civil society today, that it's a sort of benchmark for European community. So when European community imposes, for instance, the sanctions against these high-level executives, Press Secretary of Mr. Putin, Mr. Peskov, expresses that they are not efficient from one point of view, and that from another point of view that it's out of right of Europe to do it, and how European community has to understand if it's sufficient or not, or if we don't cross the red line from another side. And that's exactly the position of Russian civil society, to understand if what Europe has done and what Europe is going to do is aligned with interests of Russia, like of democratic country, or it's only helps or does not help to the fight against the clique of Mr. Putin. So from this point of view, we think that in our association, that actually we are only 100 people and approximately 2,000 there in our mailing lists. But for instance, I hope that Andrei will tell about it later, that our joint initiative about the action to support Mr. Navalny, where approximately 40 MPs, okay, Andrei, you will tell about it later. It's quite important initiative that we can start and that we can support. So from our point of view, the way of work with Russian civil society, it's a really important way of harmonizing of efforts of European community with real needs of Russia, and it will make the efforts the most effective if the position of Russian civil society will be taken into account, and if the Russian civil society is supported. So that's mainly all. That's one of our positions that I think it's extremely important to be discussed today. Thank you once more, and I hope that now we can discuss how to do it.
Thank you very much, Nikolai. I am going to give the floor to Vladimir Karamurza, who, as you know, if you've been following the news, was arrested yesterday. So perhaps you can start by telling us what happened yesterday, and then of course make your sort of opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Raymond. I want to thank Prime Minister Kubilius and the Friends of European Russia Forum of the European Parliament and Russie-Libertés for organizing our conversation today. Always good to be back with friends and colleagues on this platform. I suppose I also have to thank the Moscow Police Department and the Prosecutor's Office for me to be able to speak today, because we were all released from police detention on Saturday evening and the trials are starting on Wednesday, the day after tomorrow. So I have just these couple of days to be able to do this, and this was long scheduled. So I suppose I'm grateful to them for that as well. But thank you so much for having me. Thank you for hosting this very important conversation. What happened on Saturday was that I don't even know where to start with this. You know, I think Franz Kafka would have been frankly ashamed of his writing if he just looked at Vladimir Putin's Russia today, because I think his imagination would not have brought him anywhere close to describing the situation we have. We were supposed to have a forum of elected municipal lawmakers from across Russia on Saturday in Moscow. About 150 municipal councillors from 56 Russian regions, literally from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from all over the country, came together to sort of try to coordinate their efforts. The best historical parallel that sort of struck me as we gathered there on Saturday morning in the Izmailova Hotel, and that's what I wanted to speak about actually in the first session, but instead of me, it was the police colonel who took the floor without permission from the moderator. But the closest historical parallel for me was the active participation of representatives of local self-government in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, the Zemstvos and the city dumas, in the nationwide movement for a constitution and the parliament. That is, of course, a movement we have to start again today, as our constitution has now been destroyed by these Frankenstein amendments last year, and as our parliament is, as famously described by its own former speaker, Boris Gryzlov, is not the place for discussion. That's a movement we have to start again. And it's very appropriate that once again, this movement is being led by representatives of a local elected self-government. Those lawmakers in Russia who may not have much power, because as all of you know, local self-government does not have many powers and many prerogatives in Russia. But what they do have is something that the gray suits from the State Duma have not had for a long time, and that is democratic legitimacy. Real democratic legitimacy derived from voters, the only legitimacy that should be possible in Europe in the 20th century, but one that we are lacking at every other level of government except the municipal level for now. And what happened on Saturday may be a sign that this last level of independent political activity is too much for the Kremlin now as well. So about 20 minutes into our forum, all the doors were blocked, and about 80 armed and full gear police officers stormed into the room. The police colonel who commanded this special force battalion approached our panel, took the microphone and announced to the entire room that we are violating Russian federal law on furthering the activities of an undesirable foreign organization, and that everybody who is present in the conference room is hereby detained by police. This was, of course, met by very loud laughter. You know, people we are well used to all of this by now, and many of us, as you know, have seen much worse. But this is actually the first time in my memory, and I've spoken to colleagues as we were driven away in paddy wagons to police stations. I asked colleagues, and they had the same impression. None of us ever remember an entire room, an entire conference room, being detained. We've had many events that were sabotaged and canceled, but usually this takes the shape of electricity suddenly going down, or a pipe bursting, or a bomb scare coming in, or something like this. This time, everything was planned actually with the opposite intention. So they allowed us to begin. And then, as we now understand, as we sort of understood the timeline later on, they blocked all the exits from the hall initially, and only then announced the detention. So the goal was actually to detain everybody who was in the room, about 200 people in total. So we were actually planning, as the organizers of the forum, we were planning to sort of, after we had the initial panels, to divide participants into sort of sectional groups. Instead, we were all divided, I suppose, in territorial groups, because some of us were taken to Preobrazhenskaya police station, others to Novokosino police station, others yet to Pirova. About 150 out of the 200 detainees were incumbent elected municipal lawmakers. As Lev Schlossberg, a prominent opposition leader and a regional lawmaker himself from Pskov, said quite aptly, quite humorously, but also quite correctly, that the last time something like this happened was in January of 1918 when Lenin forcibly disbanded the Russian Constituent Assembly. That was the last time a unit of security forces came in and disbanded a meeting of lawmakers. Everybody who was in the room was charged under Article 20.33 of the Code of Administrative Offenses of the Russian Federation. That is the offense of furthering activities of a foreign undesirable organization. They initially didn't say what organization they're talking about. Of course, I don't need to explain to you the absurdity of a conference of elected Russian municipal lawmakers being announced as a foreign undesirable organization. In the end, of course, as could be expected, they said that it was Open Russia, Mikhail Khodorkovsky's NGO, that we were all supposedly furthering the activities of. Many of the people that I was with in the police station where I was held, municipal lawmakers from the regions, came up to me only when they were actually handed those protocols that the administrative charges have been put out. They asked me, what is this organization? So the first time they actually learned the name of the organization they were supposedly furthering the activities of was when they saw the indictments in print. Again, I think Franz Kafka would have long run out of imagination by now, just sort of faced with the political reality we have here in Russia. I think that the sort of the most important signal was that now the authorities are not willing to tolerate even this lowest, smallest, the most local level of independent political activity, because this has been, for many years now, sort of the last bastion of remaining political pluralism in Russia. And there are now, in fact, hundreds of independent or opposition municipal lawmakers elected across the country from parties such as Yabloko, from coalitions such as United Democrats, which was actually the organizer of Saturday's forum, not some mythical foreign organization that most participants have never heard of. And with the help of these groups, there are those independent voices at the local level. And apparently even that now is too much for the people who are sitting behind the Kremlin wall, especially, of course, as everybody knows, as Prime Minister Kubilius said it in his opening remarks. This is the year of our parliamentary elections. Exactly 6 months from now, 19th of December of this year, we will have the elections, or elections, quote unquote, of course, to the State Duma. And one of the effects of all of those charges that we all got on Saturday, or that the indictments, but the conviction will come from the trials this week. If there's a second one under the same article within a year, this will mean, first of all, the possibility of a criminal indictment and up to 6 years in prison. This is the Criminal Code Article 284.1, which is the article that Yana Antonova in Krasnodar and Anastasia Shevchenko in Rostov-on-Don were convicted under in the last few weeks, thankfully without real prison sentences, but the article carries up to 6 years in prison. And of course, even if it's a suspended sentence, that carries with it the disqualification from running for any elected office at any level. So this is relevant because this is an election year. And I think what's also sort of an important takeaway from all of this is that the authorities, I think they've given up on trying to create appearances and pretenses of any sort of legal approach. I mean, for many years, they would obviously persecute people and prosecute people for political reasons, but they would always try to cover it up with some sort of quasi-legal explanations. Even opposition activists who were attending rallies, people could be charged with cursing in public, or, not following sanitary rules, or, police would plant drugs, as they did with journalist Ivan Golunov a couple of years ago, and so on. Now they're not doing any of this. They have actually detained 200 participants at a conference just because they were there. And they said as much. So no pretenses, no appearances, at least everything's out in the open. So that was a pretty good sort of illustration where we are in terms of the political reality and the realities that civil society in Russia exists today. But, frankly, I was asked by many journalists in these last couple of days, what does it say about sort of, is it a new turn for the Putin regime? Is it sort of a new level of repression or whatever it is? And I would always respond that, I think it's just some more icing on the cake. It's a new illustration, as it were, of what these people are doing. But frankly, I don't think it's pretty meaningful to talk about any sort of new turns and new levels. A couple of weeks ago, we held a memorial vigil on Bolshoi Moskvoretsky Bridge near the Kremlin for the 6th anniversary of the assassination of Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov. 6 years on, the organizers and masterminds of his assassination, the most high-profile political assassination in the modern history of Russia, continue to be fully shielded and fully protected from the highest levels of the Russian government. If you can murder the opposition leader and get away with it, I think it's pretty meaningless to talk about any new levels or new turns or actually repressions of human rights violations. What can be worse than that? So, but nevertheless, it's an illustration, especially during this election year, on the aspect of EU-Russia relations that we are talking about. You know, one of the sort of favorite Kremlin lines is that, and by the way, of course, apart from the police, there was also these cameras from the Kremlin-run state propaganda TV channels. No doubt in the next few days, we will see new revelations about, you know, a group of foreign agents and subverters and enemies of the state, or whatever other terms they want to use, that are trying to destabilize the political situation in Russia. That's their favorite line, that we are all puppets of foreigners, that we are all agents of the West, that we all want the West to give us money or to give us political support or to give us, or to effect regime change in Russia, you know, all this other nonsense they keep coming up with. Of course, as I don't need to tell you, none of that has anything to do with reality. It's only for us Russians here in Russia to change the political situation in our country. Only Russians can do that. Only Russians should do that. And only Russians one day will do that. It cannot be any other way. The only thing we do actually ask of our friends and partners in the Western world, and especially our neighbors on the European continent, to get directly to the topic of our conversation today, is that you actually stay true to your own values and to your own principles. And I'm deeply grateful to this coalition formed by Prime Minister Kubilius of the European Parliament, the Friends of European Russia Forum, for making sure that the EU leadership is reminded regularly and constantly about this necessity. Support for civil society, engagement with civil society, direct people-to-people exchanges. That's, of course, among the 5 guiding principles of EU policy towards Russia. The EU-Russia Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, that is still technically in force, signed in 1994, came into effect in 1997, very clearly states that the cooperation between 2 partners, the EU and Russia, is based on a shared respect for democratic principles and human rights, as outlined for the Helsinki Final Act and the OSCE Charter of Paris for a New Europe, both of which Russia is a signatory of. Now, of course, for many years now, this respect for democratic principles is no longer, and human rights, is no longer shared by the EU and the current Russian leadership, but it doesn't mean that the EU should also turn a blind eye and look the other way. And so that's actually the most important point, I think, to our conversation today, is that the only thing that those of us in the Russian democratic movement, in Russian civil society, in Russian society generally, want from the European Union is to stay true to your own values. And this means several things. For example, very importantly, and I'm very happy to see my good friend André Gatolin here in this discussion, whom I first met many years ago, almost a decade ago, as part of our joint work, joint advocacy for a Magnitsky Law in France, a law that would bring targeted individual visa and financial sanctions against high-ranking human rights abusers and corrupt officials in Vladimir Putin's close circle. You know, for years we've had this enormous duplicity and double standard where you had the same people here in Russia at the top of the Kremlin leadership who would abuse and attack and undermine the most basic norms of democracy and the rule of law in our country, and then come to the West and enjoy the benefits and the privileges that these same notions of democracy and rule of law offer in your countries, because it's in your countries where they have their second homes, their bank accounts, where they spend their holidays, where they send their wives and their mistresses on shopping trips, and so on. And, you know, this is, of course, enormous hypocrisy on their part, the people who want to steal in Russia and then spend and stash away that stolen money in the West. But it's also complicity and enabling on the part of those Western countries that accept such individuals and their dirty money. And so I'm very, very happy and proud of the small part I played in this work, but very happy mostly to see that finally we do have those Magnitsky mechanisms, not only in the United States and Canada, but also now in the United Kingdom and the European Union as of December of 2020. Thank you, André. Thank you, Prime Minister Kubilius, for everything you have done to finally make this happen. Now this mechanism has to work. It has to do more than just to sit there. It has to be implemented, and they have to be high-ranking, meaningful people placed on those sanctions lists. Again, I want to stress, we're not talking about sanctions on Russia as a country, as the Kremlin propaganda tries to portray it. These are individual targeted sanctions against specific people who actually deserve them. And this mechanism has to be used. Another thing that's actually articulated in the guiding principles of EU policy towards Russia, engagement with civil society, people-to-people relations, people-to-people exchanges, making it easier for Russians, especially young Russians, to have access to EU countries. Obviously, we're talking about the post-pandemic situation, which is hopefully coming soon. For people to be able to go more freely, perhaps with a prospect of visa-free or at least relaxed visa requirements, because there's nothing that can counter lies and propaganda as effectively as actually seeing the reality. Very importantly, to engage directly in terms of the information space. I remember a few years ago when Latvia held the rotating presidency of the European Union, their foreign ministry came up with the idea of creating sort of an EU-wide media organization in the Russian language of the kind of, for example, the Americans do with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. This, at least so far, has not come to reality. I think that's an idea that should be seriously considered. And very importantly, also to have this integrity, not only in economic sphere, to talk already about the corrupt money and the oligarchs and the sanctions, but also in the political and legal sphere. And, you know, we're talking about the Duma elections this year, for example. A few months ago, Vladimir Milov, Aleksei Navalny, Ilya Yashin, and myself testified in a similar setting before a European Parliament Foreign Affairs Committee hearing. And one of the messages that was very clearly articulated by all of us, primarily by Aleksei Navalny, was that the question of non-recognition, de jure non-recognition of the results of the so-called Duma election this September, which will likely be marked by all the same fraud and manipulations and also disqualification of most opposition candidates, that question should be on the agenda. And those so-called parliamentarians that will be the result of this so-called election should not be recognized as parliamentarians, as legal representatives of the Russian people, because they are not. And going forward, very importantly, on the same point to 2024, which will be the end of Vladimir Putin's current and constitutionally final mandate in office, all these amendments that were passed to the Russian constitution last year were passed in an illegal and an illegitimate manner. This position is very clearly reflected in European Parliament resolution on Russia that was passed last September by an overwhelming majority. I can go on for a long time, but I won't. I'm happy to address some questions. There are at least three major ways in which those constitutional amendments, the way they were enacted, violated both Russia's own domestic law and also our OSCE obligations. So these amendments are null and void from a legal point of view. And if Mr. Putin attempts to stick to power beyond the end of his final mandate in May of 2024, one of those amendments, of course, was one allowing him to waive the presidential term limits for himself. I think a very clear policy of non-recognition on the part of the European Union of this illegitimate usurpation of power should be on the agenda as well. Very finally, the very name of the group, the coalition that hosts this conversation today, Friends of European Russia Forum, is very, very important, because I think it's important for all of us, both of us here in Russia and our neighbors and friends on the EU side of Europe, very important for us to remember that when we are talking about EU-Russia relations, we are talking about relations within the same family. Russia is a part of Europe. We are an integral part of Europe. However much the people in the Kremlin today would like to pretend otherwise, we have centuries of European culture, European history, European mentality, and no policies by Mr. Putin can change that. And so I think it's very important for us to start thinking ahead today, because things are not going to remain forever the way they are. Nothing is eternal, and the regime of Vladimir Putin is not going to be an exception. It's important for us to start thinking today about that post-Putin future and about how a future democratic Russia can be integrated into that European family. Václav Havel once referred to Czechoslovakia, then still Czechoslovakia's post-communist transformation. The goal of this transformation is our return to Europe. This was Havel's phrase. Well, I think this has to be one of the main goals of a post-Putin democratic transformation in Russia, Russia fully returning to Europe. Let's work on that together.
Well, thank you very much for these extremely sort of thought-provoking comments, and they raise a lot of questions, which I will get back to. I took a few notes, but I do want to give a chance to all of our panelists to say their statements first. I'd like to bring in Vladimir Milov into the conversation now. Given everything you have just said, Vladimir Kara-Murza, obviously, Mr. Milov, given everything that's happened to Aleksei Navalny over the past few months, I'm sure you have quite a lot more to add there. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And it's a great honor to speak in such a distinguished company. And it's also great to know for us pro-European Democrats in Russia that we have friends in Europe. And thank you, Andres, very much for everything you're doing and for your constant support. But the problem is that we have not only friends, unfortunately, in Europe and across the Atlantic. And I wanted to specifically address this dilemma of pragmatism in Russia policy versus human rights and support of civil society. There was always a heated debate about it. For instance, there was a very strange article recently published by the Atlantic Council directly arguing for dropping the human rights off the agenda for American policy towards Russia and replacing it with cooperation on strategic issues and pragmatic approach. Now, listen, this is a very important topic. It will perpetually come up. So I suggest that our European friends craft a very specific targeted approach on how to counter that arguments, because I know that luckily you disagree with these suggestions. So I would say a few things. First, it's very important when we saw Vladimir Putin's regime evolving over the past 20 years, it's always very important not to miss the connection between the aggressive policy of lawlessness at home and further after consolidation of domestic power, beginning to export this aggressive lawless behavior abroad. Because we have had these conversations for many years. There's a lot of track record of what has been said and done. And in the middle of Vladimir Putin's rule, in his first couple of terms, we were constantly saying to our American and European colleagues that, look, you express concern about the crackdown on civil rights in Russia, but don't do much about it. However, this is the beginning of a very worrying trend, because this will spill over into foreign policy. It will not end up at home on a crackdown on domestic civil society. Once Putin consolidates domestic control, he will begin to behave more aggressively internationally. There is a direct link, which I will explain in a minute. And we were proven right. With the Georgian war, with the war in Ukraine, with interference in Western democracies and many other stuff that Putin is doing. So if you take a look at the current shaping of Russian policy and the rhetoric of Vladimir Putin and his closest allies from the National Security Council, which is de facto running the country. It's a de facto junta, which is meeting weekly and discussing the most important issue, so-called permanent council of National Security Council members, 12 people, mostly so-called siloviki. So when you listen to their rhetoric, it's strikingly clear how intertwined is domestic and foreign policy in their own view, in the view of Vladimir Putin and his colleagues. They do not separate these issues. They consider it to be one. They do not consider us, Russian Democrats who want to make the voices of ordinary Russians heard in domestic politics. They do not just label us foreign agents. They truly consider us agents of foreign governments because they believe that democracy and the Western liberal order is an existential threat to them. As they remember the Soviet experience, obviously what happened after the Berlin Wall fell is that Russians have realized that the Western system, democratic market system, is far more efficient. So they have opted to switch sides and choose a transition to market democracy. You have built a much more attractive system than Putin did. They completely realized that. which is why they see you as an existential threat. And they consider people in the West who want to drop the human rights issue off the agenda as, let me be ginger here, useful people. Let me call it that way, right? So they really do not separate domestic politics and domestic human rights issues from a Western democracy, which they consider in principle a hostile model. A model which might look attractive in the future to ordinary Russians, which would demand change at some point the same way they did 30 years ago. This is what they're panically afraid of, which is why they do stuff like attack a forum of municipal council members and arrest 200 people, which is nonsense from a rational point of view. But given their fear of future democratization in Russia under a European model or American model, that can be easily explained. So for Putin, domestic and foreign policy is one. They consider liberal democratic order as an existential threat. They want to erode it worldwide, and which is why it is very important for Europeans to understand you are not protected. You think that some of the Europeans who suggest pragmatic, rational approach and dropping the human rights off the agenda, they believe that by concluding some form of agreement with Putin and dropping some issues unpleasant to Putin from the agenda, you might sort of secure yourself. Secure, I don't know, whatever, gas supplies, trade, investments, cooperation in strategic areas, counterterrorism, arms control, whatever, right? But listen, I mean, Putin is in power for more than 20 years. His track record of his credibility as to how much he's tending to obey his own commitments and obligations is very clear. Putin willingly breaches his obligations whenever he feels necessary. He is an unreliable partner in the first place. And dropping the human rights off the agenda sends a very, very negative signal. It says to Putin, look, Western governments, Western nations are easily ready to drop important existential issues for the sake of some pragmatic agreements in some areas which they consider important. So he can always expand his territory. Now we drop human rights. Next time, and listen, we are already approaching this. Next time, Putin will demand, drop Ukraine. Ukraine is mine. Don't interfere. Give it to me as an area of my strategic dominance, and I will give you anything else you want. Gas, arms control, counterterrorism, Middle East policy, whatever, but give me Ukraine. So human rights is first, Ukraine will be second. What will be third? He will not stop. I mean, listen, we have enough material over 20 years to understand that this is the guy, whenever he gets what he wants from his Western partners, he moves further. We saw that many times. So I think we need to understand that this pragmatic, so-called pragmatic approach is not only naive, but dangerous, because it's one way for Putin to encourage him into permanent expansion of his territory of influence. He considers these ideas that we should drop discussion on human rights in Russian civil society as your weakness. You need to be pretty straightforward about that. He considers these suggestions as your weakness. So my point is that we simply should not think about human rights and civil society and democratic freedoms in Russia as just some separate issue in a vacuum, which might be added or removed from the agenda like you add salt or pepper whenever you eat, right? It's not. It's very much connected. And assault on human rights in Russia is simply an early warning sign that Putin is far more decisive in consolidating his power and pursuing his goals, both at home or abroad. Like this issue about the poisoning attempt of Aleksei Navalny, we have discovered that there's this whole FSB unit specifically running around and attempting to kill many people. Sometimes successfully, luckily other times, like with Vladimir Karamurza, not. But he already did it in a European soil with Gebrev and Skripal, who will be next. European politicians think that they might be safe. Well, I think if you have a specific, large, well-organized unit of people who is doing this on a permanent basis, think again. So moving to a conclusion, what should be the center of discussion? I think what Vladimir had described with this crackdown on municipal forum on Saturday are early beginnings of a showdown for a State Duma election campaign. Putin actually sends a message: I will not tolerate any opposition activity during elections of Duma. Now, think about what can be achieved if only we have held like even remotely free and fair election in Russia. There will be people in Russian parliament, like ourselves, you know, who will openly call within the corridors of power on state television for end of aggressive foreign policy. That will be a major breakthrough from which the whole democratic world will benefit. Now, if there will be no democratic election in September, which I think we are heading this way, there will be another rubber stamp parliament, which will rubber stamp any aggression, any intrusion, which will authorize Putin to do whatever he wants, continuing his aggressive foreign policy course. That is all intertwined. That is all connected. There is no real separation between Russian domestic politics and civil society and the foreign policy. So State Duma elections in this regard become very, very important. And I think there should be a clear message to Putin that Duma appointed through non-democratic process will not be recognized in Europe, which Andres have spoken about many times. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, you've raised some very important issues that we will definitely have to circle back to. At this stage, I'd like to bring into the conversation Ms. Audrine Perkauskiene, who is the head of Russia division at the European External Action Service, clearly now sort of moving to the more institutional perspective here. Please go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rim, and good afternoon, colleagues. And let me start by assuring you, Vladimir and Deves, that we are not dropping human rights and support to civil society and people-to-people contacts from our EU-Russia agenda. And I would say quite on the contrary. This debate is very timely shortly after the comprehensive discussion on this subject at the Foreign Affairs Council last month, and ahead of further discussions at the next week's strategic debate at the European Council by our state and government leaders. So you see that the EU is busy discussing Russia, but also taking action. So firstly, Nikolai Koblekov and Vladimir Karamurza already referred to sanctions, and ministers indeed unanimously reached a political agreement on imposing sanctions using for the very first time the EU global human rights sanctions legislation to respond to the arbitrary arrest, prosecution, and sentencing of Mr. Aleksei Navalny, but also the violent repression of peaceful protests. So on 2nd of March, indeed, sanctions were swiftly adopted. We started with 4 high-level Russian officials responsible for serious human rights violations, but that's only the start. More sanctions under the same EU global human rights sanctions legislation will hopefully be adopted by Foreign Affairs Council already next Monday in a week. And it will be a part of a slightly broader, also geographically a bit more balanced package. Secondly, we decided to step up our support to civil society in Russia, which will also be discussed at the European Council next week. And we are now working together with the European Commission on modalities of action so that our support is provided in more flexible ways based on reassessment and communication at the very grassroots level. And we are realistic, knowing very well that the space for expertise of EU-based civil society organizations is limited in Russia and is getting even more limited. However, despite the recently adopted legislative restrictive legislation on the so-called foreign agents and undesirable organizations, etc., it is still possible to reach out to civil society organizations through regional cooperation, through our support mechanisms, intermediary organizations, etc. And I would say that the widespread protests across Russia following the detention of Mr. Navalny send a clear signal of social engagement and the willingness to take risk despite the increasingly difficult environment. And we are convinced that Russian civil society is still able to achieve positive results and is still asking for European support. So let me briefly present you how the EU supports the Russian civil society, but also people-to-people contacts. So at the political level, due to the absence of dedicated EU-Russia human rights consultations, since already November 2013, and also due to the lack of formal dialogue, the EU's position continues to be expressed through both public diplomacy, such as statements, tweets, etc., and also quiet diplomacy. And our very active EU delegation and in Moscow and also member states' embassies continue to raise human rights concerns with Russian authorities, and also high-level EU officials in every meeting with Russians, and there are very few meetings with Russians, raise the issues of human rights and civil society, etc. Civil society organizations from EU member states and also EU delegation in Moscow continue grassroots level contacts with their Russian civil society counterparts by organizing frequent meetings with human rights defenders or activists, seminars, conferences, but also support. Another very important tool we are using is trial observation by diplomats, and I believe it's a very important instrument. It gives visibility to activists, human rights defenders, and NGOs under pressure. And I know that they very much appreciate the attention generated by international presence. I have to underline, however, that it is getting more and more complicated for our colleagues in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the regions to attend trials, as they are being followed and intimidated. But despite that, we continue doing so. Another important tool is both our delegation and member states embassies are trying not only to monitor and report on legislative developments and human rights situation, but also to identify at the earliest possible stage forthcoming repressive legislation and potential ways to react. Another important tool is visa facilitation. It was already mentioned by Vladimir. Member states are facilitating the issuing of multiple entry visas with long-term validity for Russian citizens and especially NGOs, representatives, and human rights defenders. And just to mention that Russians are the highest recipients of Schengen visas, and the number of visas issued to Russian citizens continues to increase. I believe it is a sign of the continued interest of Russian people to travel and to discover the EU, and we shall capitalize on this. Now about the financial support. I'd like to highlight that the EU is the lead donor for Russian civil society projects. And the EU support is crucial for enabling Russian civil society organizations to continue their work in an ever more restrictive environment. Unfortunately, most other international donors have been either forced to leave or left voluntarily before being declared undesirable. Some member states, including France, continue bilateral programs in this respect as well, but I have to unfortunately underline very, very few member states. Then it comes to the EU. We are now funding 24 projects in Russia, totaling 11 million euros, and we are trying to make sure our financial instruments are flexible, which is a bit complicated because we have strict rules. And we are also very much focused on providing high level of confidentiality. Now, Vladimir mentioned the area of people-to-people, which is extremely important because Russian regime is not Russian people. And the main directions for our action are education, science and research, environment and climate change, gender, health, cross-border cooperation, transnational programs, etc. So very briefly, in the area of education, as you know, over 23,000 Russians were beneficiaries of Erasmus Plus program, and the program will continue for 21 to 27, and we plan to continue supporting students, but also promoting cooperation in higher education, youth non-formal education, volunteering, continuation and reinforcement of universities cooperation through our EU Study Week instrument. We are also planning to expand cooperation in the area of vocational training through the European Training Foundation. Additionally, we have Jean Monnet activities that support studies on the European integration process, so work here continues. Then very few words about science and research diplomacy and cooperation. Here, the success of quite successful Horizon 2020 program is Horizon Europe. And we will continue cooperation in a number of areas, including health and civil aeronautics, but also a vast scope of other activities for research cooperation. Finally, let us not forget the importance of communication and public diplomacy. And here a special focus is and will continue to be placed on joint public and cultural diplomacy events organized by the ES, EU delegation in Russia, but also member states, targeted media work and systematic use of various websites, social media channels, etc. I have to say that here we are trying to be careful and ensure that any visibility does not result in harm to the Russian recipients of EU funding, especially in light of the Foreign Agents Law and the related administrative penal consequences. So let me conclude by expressing appreciation to the remarkable work of European parliamentarians, but especially so civil society, courageous civil society, was present today, but not only them, for their dedication to the cause of democratization of Russia. And like Vladimir mentioned already, and needless to say that at a time of strained political relations with the Russian authorities, civil society has a special value for us. And we have no quarrel with the Russian people. On the contrary, we therefore need to build bridges, in particular with the youth, experts, academics, like I mentioned earlier. And many of them, unlike the current authorities, see the future of Russia in the family of democratic nations. And we believe in that. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrone, and we're already getting quite a few questions through the chat, which I have seen. I want everyone to know, and I've taken note of, and we will circle back to those. I also wanted to let some of you know, those who are raising their hands, unfortunately, I won't be able to give you the floor. So if you would like to ask a question, please do write it in the chat, and I will make sure to read it. I would like to bring into the conversation now Senator André Gatolin, who is a senator for the Hauts-de-France in the French Senate and the vice chair of the Foreign Affairs, Defense and Armed Forces Committee, and of course someone who has worked on Russia for many, many years. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Rim, and thanks a lot to all the organizers, my good friends of Russie-Libertés. Special thanks to Michaeli and also to Vladimir Karamurza for the very nice word he say about me, but I think I'm only a little thing inside that. But first of all, I would like to stress the point that if we take action as parliamentarians from European countries, we must say some very, very precise thing. We must say that Russia is a part of Europe. We are not the enemies of Russia and Russian people. And if we act toward the Russian regime, it's because we are a great family. That's very important to say that, because this is not an outside action on Russia. This is a community group for people who share values and democratic involvement that act together. The second thing we must stress is that it's very important to act at the European level, but it's very difficult to coordinate. So the European Parliament do very nice things, and I would like to give all my greetings to my friend Bernard Guetta, and okay. And we have also European institutions such as the Council of Europe and the Parliamentarian Assembly, and later on my close friend Jacques Maire will talk about it. We have also the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where we have also parliamentarians. That's very important because we can act there, and in the coming election at the Duma, it's very important that we have a strong delegation to observe and control at an international level what will happen. But I think we must also create new kind of coordination. Just an example. 9 months ago, we created the IPAC. This is the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. It's something very small, but we decided to create that at the beginning with 5 or 6 parliamentary representatives from various countries. Today, we are 20 countries represented plus the European Parliament. And we tried together with a cross-party involvement, people from the right, the left, the center, from everywhere, to coordinate our action as legislators. We've blocked some extradition treaty from Hong Kong or from France or Germany to Hong Kong and so on. We've begun to launch an action on genocide recognition on Uyghur people and so on. And I think it's a very important type of action we must create. And we've launched this very small initiative 2 weeks ago, asking to parliamentarians, first French parliamentarians, and after that some good friends from the European Parliament have done that too. Free Navalny with his posters designed by some designers from Russie-Libertés. It's only a small action, but it's very visual. It can be spread all over the social networks. Yesterday, I had the return from Navalny's mothers that says it's very, very important to do that. But it's only a first step. It's a way when we go at the Senate or the National Assembly or in other assemblies from a national parliament in Europe, we can identify clearly people who are involved in protecting democrats and democratic action in Russia. That's the first step. And after that, we have to create this interparliamentary association alliance on Russian Federation. I think it would be very, very important because some action can be taken at the European level. And Vladimir Karamurza, remember that we have worked a lot for 10 years for having Magnitsky Act all over the Europe, and not only Europe, Canada, or United States, and so on. But to succeed in having this kind of European laws, it has taken a lot of time. And even if we've passed this act last December, it's a small act. It's very difficult to put in action. So due to the recent events, 4 people from the Russian authorities are under this new kind of targeted action, but it's too small. And on some topics, we must act as a coordinate multinational level. Take an example. What do we do about the Nord Stream 2 project? For French authority, we don't want this project, but German government, Danish government is very in favor of. So we have to ask parliamentarians from right, left, or every kind of a political party to put also the pressure inside their country, because we don't know exactly today what is the legal status of that, if it is something to be decided by the European Commission or the European institution. Many people say, no, this is not a competence of Europe, but we have also to act at a national level to put the pressure on German government on that, because this is not a global sanction to stop that in front of Russian people. We can explain that the country as Russia, Federation of Russia, today that make a large part of his economy, his wealth, or his so-called wealth on extractive industry, on mining industry, is not a good political choice for people living in this country. It is as if you are burning your inheritance in a few decimals. So it is also a way to put in debate inside the Federation of Russia, among the people, among the election, the fact, what do we want to create as an economy? Is it only exportation of natural resources, or is it the will of developing a modern, free market economy inside the country? So we have many, many topics on that. And I think if we create this kind of interparliamentary alliance on Russian Federation, we can stress the point on targeted question, targeted sanction on visa question, as Vladimir reminds us a few minutes ago. We can also coordinate action, because it's not only punctual action on the election. We have to have a global approach on Russia, not separate human rights from political system, from economical relation, and from global security. And so we've begun with some good friend, our good friend Aleksei Prokopiev, to write a very small but dense statement to explain what could be this interparliamentarian European action in favor of Russia. This is not, again, Russia, it is on Russia for freedom and liberty. I think it would be nice if we could develop that. I've discussed with my very old friend Emanuelis Zingeris from Lithuania. I know this is a good friend of Andrius Kubilius. I've discussed with people from Czech Republic, and especially Pavel Fischer, who is chair of a Foreign Affairs Committee in the Czech Republic. And they say, we are interested. Also at the Canadian Parliament, there are so many people that say, okay, we want to go in this kind of coordination of legislators to help Russian people, and also to put the pressure on the regime, and trying to control, or to help to control, what will succeed during the next coming general election in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, André, and we will definitely get back to that. I think you've raised, again, some interesting questions between the different positions that are sometimes not on the same page, of course, between sort of 27 member states. We're also joined by Jacques Maire, who is an MP in France, but also one of the rapporteurs on Navalny at the Council of Europe. And I think it would be quite interesting to hear from him at this stage as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Mrs. Montaz, and thank you also for the organizers. I'm very, very happy to join this forum because it's important to have a quite, I would say, first-hand perceptions of the way all of you react. And also, thank you to those of you who have contributed already of the hearings about the mission of Navalny. So there are two reports on Navalny detention and Navalny poisoning. And they will be addressed in the coming months. Just as a standpoint, on the specific situation of Russia related to Council of Europe, what is very important to have in mind is that the only and main and only reason for some countries, including France, to, I would say, to authorize and to compromise on the return of Russians within the Council of Europe was for the sake of Russian civil society, in fact. Was for the sake of protecting these actors through the European Court of Human Rights. And it's true that after 18 months of, I would say, this test period, the outcomes in terms of behavior of Russians is quite negative. So the debate we had in 2 years ago about the reasons to reincorporate fully Russians in the Council of Europe has completely changed in my view, and in the view also of the many, I would say, actors, stakeholders, even governments. And if there is no consequence of Russia being part of Council of Europe in terms of standards, procedures, protection, then what is the point? So that makes important the debate which will take place in the coming months is about these reports, not only within the Assembly, but also within the Council of Ministers. Meanwhile, I'd like to say that we do all our duties, of course, the different political groups, but also Rick Dems, who is in Moscow today. We do all our duties in order to try to, I would say, to give, not to offer an exit door to the Russians, but to give Russians possibility, I would say, to adjust and to, I would say, to give not only signals, but acts related to Navalny. I saw the question about the meaning of the venue of Rick Dems in Russia. It was very debated among group leaders, as you might imagine, after, notably because the first attempt was made in December, so he went there. It was not possible for him to follow his agenda because he was I would say, contact person for COVID when he just arrived in Moscow. So this has to be completely replanned. And now we have the question whether it has a meaning to, I would say, to send back Rick currently, right now, after Borrell, I would say, full failure. So the idea is not to have a kind of, I would say, public statements, basically, and to say, okay, I want to go to Russia and I want just to come back to Russia with some good news. This is not the idea. So very limited communication. I'm not even sure that there will be a joint press conference with Lavrov or with the Minister of Justice, but I would say in-depth and discussions in closed doors in order to give a chance to, I would say, to reinvigorate, to reinitiate the respect of the full governance, which is not negotiable, of the Council of Europe by a member state. In order just to put in the hands of the Russian authorities, there are two ways. One is to come back to, I would say, respect of governance, including a possibility for the reporters to go there and to investigate about political prisoners, about civil society, about respect of human rights court decisions. And in this case, if this is a route which is followed, then it's not only declarations, but also acts. And there are many acts which are possible for them. I doubt, of course, the outcome of this result when I hear about what has been said by all of you, and particularly about Vladimir, about the meeting of the last weekend. Of course I do. But if we do not give to the Russians all the elements of decision, it means that I would say we wouldn't have our jobs. So for the moment, maybe you have seen that I've been, I would say, kept by prankers in the last weekend. It's true that we have to be, and I have to be, and Rick have to be, and the institution have to be very, very, I would say, neutral, meaning giving at any moment of the procedure no, I would say, element of prejudice or prejudgment, and giving a chance for Russians to contribute formally to the investigations. And that is a must. Otherwise, we just diminish, I would say, the credibility of the process itself. But at the end of the process, it's true that there are possible sanctions, and these sanctions in the new context after the return of 2019 would be very different. And that is for sure also. Last point about elections. There was a question about elections in Russia. Of course, to be, I would say, when you are monitored by the monitoring committee, to have observers in the election is a must, is a do. I would say it's an obligation normally. And of course, we are ready to go for elections if they take place normally, and if we send people, it will be a very, very important element for us in our strategy, because we have to have, I would say, to be very explicit and to say what happens at the field. We have to be witnesses of the difficulties. And what I feel from you is, of course, you expect the worst in terms of behavior and independence of elections, but it's another, I would say, reason to be there on the ground. Will it be possible or not? I can't tell you, but I'm sure that if there is any possibility, we will make it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And again, I'm sure there will be quite a few questions. Hopefully we will have time to get back to it. I wanted to see if Bernard Guetta was still with us, because I don't see his video camera on.
I'm here?
Yes. See me? No, we do not see you. So I
don't understand why.
There you are.
Okay.
I think you're connected on two accounts. So one has your video and one doesn't. It's fine. It's all good.
Okay.
And so I wondered if you wanted to jump in now.
With pleasure.
You're obviously a member of the European Parliament with the Renew delegation. That has become kind of a central group in part of the Renaissance group in the Parliament. So go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay, so first, let me tell you how happy am I to share this meeting with you, and to hear, for example, the optimism of Andrius Kubilius telling them that he is sure, or almost sure, that we'll see deep changes in Russia in the next 5, 10, or 15 years. Let me tell you that I do think, like our friend Karamurza, that the effervescence in Russia is the same as the one the country have experienced in the beginning of the last century. And even during Perestroika, when I was in Moscow, I never noticed such activity, mobilization. I don't know how to say that in English, but le sème bouillonnement politique du pays.
Political effervescence is what you're looking for.
Effervescence, okay. Effervescence would be okay. So now let me tell you a short story. He was in Moscow, and I was in Paris, and all of a sudden, this old friend, a Russian intellectual, a Democrat, asked me, but Bernard, how come that Russia still belongs to the Council of Europe? Bože môj. In a very polite manner, he was asking me why the Parliament and the member states, the European Union in 2 words, weren't fighting every day since Navalny poisoning to expel the Russian regime from the Council of Europe. It was a very well-founded question, and this question, I have heard it for decades as a journalist in a dozen or so countries, more precisely in dictatorships, whose opponents were expecting the support of democracies, or at least the support of Democrats from the democracies. My friend was disappointed by our weakness toward this president. He would have liked us to be much more faithful to our common principle, his and ours and his. And therefore, the first answer to the question we are supposed to answer in this webinar is in my friend's question. In order to contribute to strengthening the Russian civil society, we, the European Union, have to speak clearer, tougher, blunter, to name and shame the Russian regime, to name it a dictatorship, and certainly not to accept it in a supposedly select club of democracy. I would add for my part that we also need to build up a common European defense as a pillar of the Atlantic Alliance in order to show Mr. Putin that we are ready to stand for democracy, to fight for it, and for our friends, if necessary, that we are not wimps, sissies, willing to turn a blind eye to political repression in order to preserve the Gemütlichkeit of our life. Let's be Democrats with muscles, but it's not enough. Muscles are only the first answer to our question, because toward Russia, we need a double-track policy. We need a double-track policy. We have to be firm with the regime, and at the same time to extend an open and friendly hand to the Russian people. We need to do more than to react. We need to act. Every day, on every occasion, we got to tell the Russian citizen, the urban middle class, the oligarchs, and even the Siloviki, yes, FSB and army, that we don't wish to harm their country, but to find a modus vivendi with the Russian Federation, the other pillar of our common continent, in order to secure mutually beneficial stability and cooperation. Our union, our governments, our political parties, our pundits and newspapers should keep telling Russia that we would wish to do together in Europe and elsewhere, together because we belong to the same civilization and actually share the same culture and the same interests. Let's keep making proposals on Belarus and Ukraine, the Arctic and Africa, medical research and Iran. If Mr. Putin accepts some of them, Iran maybe, perfect. If he doesn't, too bad for him. But the people in Russia will know that the European Union would have wished to cooperate with them in this field or another, and that our willingness is to make a rule of this cooperation. One could think, I know that, I already heard that to do this would be to lose our time, but no, it wouldn't. It wouldn't be vain, because Putin is losing ground in the Russian public opinion because of the economy, because he's aging, because 20 years it's enough, and because his policies or absence of real policy condemn Russia to a tete-a-tete with China, a prospect which is not at all thrilling for the urban middle class, the oligarch, and even and specifically the Siloviki. There is a growing political debate in Russia, not only in the oppositions, in the ruling elite also, and by putting proposals on the table, by telling openly every day that what we want is a modus vivendi with Russia, a new kind of Helsinki agreement, security and cooperation, by writing with the European Parliament an address to the Russian people. Let's speak about this idea. Let's speak about it on Rios. We could make ourselves a de facto partner in this Russian debate. This is, it would be, the second answer to our question. And now I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to bring into the conversation Madame Marie Mandras, who's a political scientist with the French National Center for Scientific Research, a professor at Sciences Po and the School of International Affairs in Paris, someone who knows Russian affairs quite well. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be addressing our group today. I don't think there is much time really for a statement, so I will be brief and try and make a few arguments. First, taking up on Vladimir Milov's excellent analysis, which I think also gives the insights into what we can do. What Vladimir said was, first, if you want to help us in Russia, do your job at home and in the EU, and he is very right. And secondly, his key argument, which is that you cannot expect concessions from the Putin regime in geopolitical issues, European security, by turning a blind eye or making concessions in the sort of souverainism of human rights and basically accepting that Russia is a dictatorship so that we have a better security in Europe. This is total nonsense, and it is our job to come up with the good arguments, the good channels of communications, to convince our governments, our multilateral organizations, our public opinions, our journalists, that this is the case. So here, how can we do it? How can we make a strong point? And in France, convince Emmanuel Macron and people around him and our lawmakers that you cannot not antagonize Putin. Putin is now structurally antagonistic and will always, whatever we do, be antagonized by us. And of course, threatened by us, because this is what I think all of our Russian friends have said. Putin is terrified. He is cornered. He is like, an agonizing beast. Mm-hmm. So the problem we have in France is that still you have many people saying, well, let's not make him even more crazy and violent. Yes, in the short term, we and Russian society and Russian opposition have to continue, even if there is more violence coming from the Russian authorities, both inside Russia and outside Russia. It's exactly the same challenge for the Belarusians. Yes, you have to move ahead, make advances, and you know that the only response from Lukashenko or Putin will be more repression and more violence. But there is no other way, because the opposition and engaged society cannot and must not themselves engage in violence. And I'd like to pay tribute to our Russian and Belarusian friends and their societies for never falling in the trap of a spiral of violence. To do this, we need to understand that this period where the dictators go for more violence will be a short period. And then neither the Lukashenko nor the Putin regimes can go for massive terror or social terror, that is terror against social groups rather than targeted repression. Our job, I think, in Europe is to convince our elites, leaderships, parliaments, and that we have to have a short-term tactical approach where the risks, I think, are limited, honestly, and have a medium-term and long-term strategy whereby we accompany Russians and Belarusians in their peaceful progress towards ending the dictatorship by institutional and peaceful means. And it is when we in Europe, in the United States and Canada, and when we have made those options fully ours and show the Russians we trust their battle and their struggle, that we can help them at best. And by doing this, not only are we defending human rights, but we are defending the security of several hundreds millions of people in Europe, Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, and elsewhere. So let's go for it.
Thank you for attempting to make that that synthesis of what many people sort of brought up here, and to add your own analysis. Our last speaker today is, and not last but not least, is Professor Sergei Guriev, who is an economist, a professor of economics at the Paris Institute of Political Studies, also at Sciences Po. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Rim. Political Institute for Political Studies is actually Sciences Po. And I will be extremely brief since everything has been said by my colleagues and friends. And I will just reemphasize, coming back to the subject of our conversation, EU-Russia's relations, what the EU can do. I think it's important to remember that most of the things that we've discussed today are not just in the interest of Russian people who want to live in a free, prosperous, democratic country, but also in the interest of Europe itself. And when we talk about sanctions and investigations against corrupt Russian business people, politicians, bureaucrats, representatives of Putin's regime and so-called elite, we should remember that this money is of course used to undermine European unity, to interfere in European political life, and to destroy this European ideal that Europe has been quite successful with challenges, but quite successfully building over recent decades. And in that sense, it is in the interest of Europe to stop the penetration of Russian corrupt money. Now, some Europeans, not just Putin's enablers, but some honest European politicians would say, we need to preserve our values, rule of law. We cannot sanction people without proving that they are actually corrupt. Their source of wealth is corruption, stealing from Russian taxpayers like myself or both Vladimirs. But it's also, we need to have a legal procedure. And I'm not against rule of law, of course. And I think there is a response to that, which is dedicating more resources within Europe to investigate Russian corruption, to prove that individual X, Y, and Z should be sanctioned, not because this individual has a Russian passport, but because his or her wealth is coming from corruption. And unfortunately, on both sides of the Atlantic, units that could have done those investigations are extremely under-resourced. And I think the practical takeaway from what we are doing now is a long-term investment in fighting cross-border corruption, especially corruption coming from Russia. And I think it will be helpful not just for democratization of Russia, but also for building resilience of Europe itself, which is part of what's often called Mogherini principles. These are actually European principles for EU policy towards Russia. And I think these principles can be reinforced and they can serve European policymakers well, but they should be reinvested in. There should be more resources devoted, not just to reach out to Russian civil society, which I also support, but also in building European resilience against Putin's interventions. As everybody said today, Putin's interest is to undermine Europe, and Europe should remember its biggest threat today, and Europe should invest resources in standing up to this threat. I will stop here so we have time for at least a few questions.
Thank you all. A few questions were sent in, and I think they're on the same theme. So I'm going to try to sort of put them together so that we can have one round of answers. Everyone spoke about the need to be more firm toward Russia. Some said there needs to be more shaming and naming and shaming. Others said that, it's obviously discarding human rights for what is called more pragmatism is just a losing approach. There are questions about why, given that Russia is back in the Council of Europe, why don't member states use that Council of Europe to put more pressure on Russia, given what's happened since its return? There's a question on using so one is, this is to Mr. Maire, which is, with the much awaited PACE report on Navalny's poisoning and imprisonment, but there's also an ongoing visit of the PACE president in Moscow. Is this going to actually lead to something? You had discussed trying to get access to sort of investigating these issues in Russia. I mean, how willing are the Russian authorities to actually cooperate with that? More broadly, what is going to happen at the European Council meeting that is upcoming on the Russia question? Perhaps Odrone and Prime Minister Kubilius can take that side, and perhaps to Vladimir Kara-Murza and Vladimir Milov. It's true that both of you have repeated that Russia is European. Clearly, there is a history of that. But French President Emmanuel Macron has been criticized for saying that Russia is European. It's been seen as a way for him to give himself more leeway in continuing his heretofore not very successful dialogue with Russia. Do you worry that this kind of line can be used by the Russian regime as a way to keep shifting the goalpost and keep taking concessions in its direction for fear of, on the French side or the European side, breaking up that conversation? But also, how do you see the German position, which, as Senator Gatolin pointed out, on Nord Stream is clearly putting ahead sort of gas considerations, which are obviously also very important for Europe. Let's be real here. How do you see the German position as well? Because I think the French position gets called out much more than the German one. But what would be really helpful from your perspective from both France and Germany today? I think I'm going to leave it there. Perhaps we can start with Prime Minister Kubilius on UCO, followed by Odrone, and then Mr. Maire, and we will end with both our Vladimirs. How about that?
Thanks a lot, Rim, and I will try to be very brief. Really, from my understanding, really, Russia is European, for sure, but I doubt about Putin regime. It's that European type. That's a problem, So we need to have very clear difference, different approach. What we think about Russia, which we wish all the best, for Russian people, really to come back to democracy and European type of development, and what we think about Putin regime. And unfortunately, Putin regime is the biggest obstacle for Russian people to develop themselves. That's the issue. That's the problem. I don't know really what will happen on the council. We had discussions in AFET. Mr. Borrell was recently also in AFET. And I would say my own, thoughts on what I see, what really where we need to move. First of all, 5 principles really were good, and still we need to keep them. But we need to remember that 5 principles were devoted to stop Putin's external aggression. That is why Ukraine is so important in those 5 principles, Minsk agreements. But Putin is starting to wage the war, not external. Now it's starting to wage an internal war against his own people, against Russian people. Before elections and so on, Vladimir Kara-Murza is bringing clear evidence how this war is looking like. And among those 5 principles, there is not enough emphasis exactly how EU should be ready to defend Russian people against the regime internal war against them. That's the issue. So we need to stress much more human rights defense and democracy defense. And what Borrell have said, he mentioned 3 principles: push back on human rights, containment of Putin regime's influences in Europe, and the last one, selective engagement, which sometimes really is not very clear what are the limits of those selective engagements, but that's what we can discuss. I would say that what at least what we are trying to see very clearly, how to strengthen sanctions, which should become really painful for the regime if they are misbehaving. That is one thing which we need to do. And two other things which I would say would be more of inspiration towards Russian people really to go for transformation. First of all, to use all the EU efforts to create belt of successful countries, starting from Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova. We see also possible transformations in Belarus, maybe that will happen. And the last point, I would say that EU should speak much more loudly and much more strategically what kind of relationship EU is ready to create with democratic Russia. When transformation will happen in Russia? What are we going to offer? Free trade, visa-free, partnership for modernization? I don't know. It's up to us to discuss, but maybe next time. But that would be also important to show Russian people what are we as EU, as the West, ready to do when democracy will come back to Russia. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to everybody.
Thank you very much. Audrone Perkauskiene, maybe you want to jump in on that question on UCO.
Thank you. And indeed, without preempting the strategic discussion on Russia at the European Council, I would say that we are expecting sober assessments by leaders of state and government on the current state of EU-Russia relations and the situation in Russia. And I believe the affirmation of the 5 guiding principles, which Russians call Mogherini principles because they hate them. And I believe that means that these principles hurt Russia. I also agree that the EU global human rights sanctions legislation will definitely be discussed, but maybe sanctions in a broader scope as well. Russia's malicious actions, including disinformation and cyber attacks and strategic communication as such, support to Eastern Partnership. And last but not least, I am absolutely sure that leaders of state and government will discuss on how to better support Russian civil society and free media and enhance people-to-people contacts, because this is extremely important. I also saw a question about Eastern Partnership civil society support programs to be open to support also Russian civil society organizations. And here I can say that we already have some programs, for example, regional component of Eastern Partnership civil society facility contains a number of actions that are also eligible for Russian civil society, to support Russian civil society. And we also have a number of cross-border cooperation programs where Russian and Eastern Partnership civil society can be supported. And by that, I mean in the region of Black Sea, Baltic Sea, for example, etc. And to finish, since it's the last time I speak today, I would like to say a final word. I think that the Russian government considers our policy based on the principles of democracy and on human rights as an existential threat. That is obvious. And I believe that is why we need to be even more proactive and in building, for example, bridges with Russian civil society. And as I mentioned earlier, in our policy and in our public diplomacy, we have to make a very clear distinction between the Russian government or Russian regime and the Russian society. Thank you very much, and over.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, I yield the floor to you.
Yes. So I saw also the question of Mr. Hummel, referring to the fact that if there is an asset which is important for civil society, it is the access to European courts. And also the question of the lack of action, supposed lack of action of the Council of Europe, as Bernard Guetta stated. I mean, something which I hear very frequently. First of all, I think that Aleksei Navalny himself is probably the best performer in terms of number of actions in front of the European Court. He has made some even in 2020 and 2021 in a few last weeks. And it's true that for us, at a certain moment of time, there will be the arbitration between giving up with these tools or I would say accepting that Russia doesn't fulfill its obligations. Frequently, I mean, there is a story and there is an institution. And the institution of the Council of Europe is not the EU institution, in terms that if we want to be, I would say, waterproof in terms of legal obligations and statutory, I would say, decisions, it has to be fulfilled in a very, I would say, sequenced way. What it means that for the moment, there is no short track, or there is no way to go to a direct, efficient decision against Russia within the Council of Europe, both Assembly and Council of Ministers, if we do not follow what has been decided in terms of, I would say, approach of sanctions. It can be triggered by the Assembly. The process can be triggered by the Assembly. The process can be triggered also by the Council of Ministers. We, as an Assembly, decided to have a full assessment with a contradictory approach, which will be debated in mid-April. And the fact that Mr. Dems is in Moscow today is a preparation of this phase. In fact, if I would like to summarize the deal, or the possibility of the deal, it is the following question. Russia decided with Mr. Navalny to use the worst possible judgment, because the judgment which was the one where the detention was based was a judgment which was already, I would say, considered as full of flaws in 2018. It means that we are directly now at the end of the process. We are directly at a moment where the Russians, I don't know if it is by chance or by decision, but they really put themselves in a situation where the confrontation can be very rapid compared to, I would say, Council of Europe standards. Meaning that if there is no signal, and you know that the jurisprudence and the Russian legislation has the possibility to give many kind of different solutions in order to release a bit the situation of Mr. Navalny. There could be a free on libération sur parole. There could be a preliminary, I would say, freedom. There are many acts which are possible. If they do not use any of them, of course, it means that there will be a full non-respect of the decision of the European Court. The Assembly will have to size this point and to position itself in April. The Council of Ministers in the last week, now in the last days, just before the weekend, addressed this point very precisely and decided, I would say, to have a regular review with increasing pressure and with interim reporting in 2 months' time. Meaning that now Russia could be the first case of the new, I would say, joint approach for sanctions. That would be possible. And it's true that if it's possible now, if there is no answer of the Russians, it will be likely, then it could be a reality, I would say, in the coming months. Do we have to be happy about that? I don't know. I'm sure that to give up the possibility to have individual access to a human court, I would say, is a big sacrifice to give it up. But what I'm sure about is that if there is no impact of the decision of the European Court, then it has no meaning for Russia to remain in the Council of Europe, and this will be addressed.
Thank you. We're already over time, but I do want to give the last word to Vladimir Kara-Murza and Vladimir Milov. Perhaps if you could figure out how to say what you need to say in about 2 minutes each. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Very briefly, I'll make 3 points. Thank you to colleagues for raising the issue of Council of Europe membership, because every single EU country is also a member of the Council of Europe, as is the Russian Federation. And so that's an important point to raise here. First of all, I personally think, and I know many colleagues in the Russian opposition share this view, but I'm only speaking for myself. I think expelling Russia as a country from the Council of Europe would be a catastrophe, because that would deprive us of the last access that we have to normal actual justice, and that is the European Court of Human Rights. It is cumbersome, it is very slow, it is very difficult, but that is the only thing we have. As Monsieur Mayor mentioned, Aleksei Navalny won not just several cases, but also at least 2 cases on Article 18, which is very rare in European court legal practice and legal history. So that's a very important avenue for us to have. This week, I'm expecting a response from the Russian Investigative Committee over the criminal charges that I filed against the 4 officers of the Federal Security Service who were identified by the Bellingcat investigations having been behind my poisonings. Of course, I know what that answer will be. And I am planning also to take this all the way up to the European Court of Human Rights, as has already Aleksei Navalny and his lawyers. Depriving Russian citizens of that right, I think, would be a grave mistake. However, as Monsieur Mayor just said, I think very, very justly, those obligations have to be meaningful, and they have actually They have to be implemented, and they have to be enforced. And I think, and that to add to our initial points about what we would like to see from European Union countries, all of which are also members of the Council of Europe, is more specific, more concrete, and more active positions, frankly, within the Council of Europe on implementation and supervision over those obligations and over those decisions. And the one area I would highlight in this especially is the area of political prisoners. I checked now, well, when the question was asked, the latest figure from the Memorial Human Rights Center is 378. This is how many people are designated currently as political prisoners under the Council of Europe's own definition, Resolution 1900, as political prisoners in Russia today. Last week, the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, the supervisory body, passed several important decisions on several member states, but including specifically on 2 Russian political prisoners, Aleksei Navalny and Aleksei Pichugin. Aleksei Pichugin is the longest serving political prisoner in Russia, the last remaining prisoner of the Yukos case, who has now been incarcerated for nearly 18 years, despite 2 decisions by the European Court of Human Rights, despite several resolutions by the Committee of Ministers, including one last week that once again called for his quickest possible release. I think it is now time to raise the question of an Article 46 violation against the Russian government at the Council of Europe. There is precedent for this also over political prisoner case, Ilgar Mamadov in Azerbaijan. I think it is now time for that because there has been a long and continuous violation. For example, in the case of Aleksei Pichugin, now also in the case of Aleksei Navalny, the Russian authorities just ignoring the a direct injunction from the European Court of Human Rights under Article 39, Rule 39, excuse me, that Aleksei Navalny should be released. Immediately, he obviously wasn't. So I think it is time to start raising, not to start raising, to actually raise Article 46 violation against the Russian government, which would be only the second time in history of the Council of Europe, but I think the situation calls for it. And on the French and German position, actually, I'd like to make the same point. Whatever legitimate criticism, and believe me, there's a lot of it, and I would just have no time, so I want to focus on this one thing. Whatever legitimate criticism we can voice, both at Macron and at Merkel, in terms of their position on Russia, each of them has managed to secure the release of at least one prominent political prisoner in Russia. In the case of Angela Merkel, it was Mikhail Khodorkovsky. In the case of Emmanuel Macron, it was Oleg Sentsov just a couple of years ago. And so I think, you know, those legal obligations that we do have as a member state of the Council of Europe have to be backed up by political will. And it is time for Western leaders, especially EU leaders, to start raising their voices in defense of political prisoners in Russia. And very finally, those people who, again, Mr. Macron can be criticized for a lot of things, but frankly, I think those people who criticize him for saying that Russia is a European country must have missed their geography lesson in school. Of course, Russia is a European country. That's a statement of fact. The Putin regime is nothing to do with Europe, as Prime Minister Kubilius has said. In fact, they're saying so openly. You know, there was a policy paper a few years ago from the Russian Culture Ministry that was entitled, "Russia is not Europe," which, you know, when people saw it, you know, not enough time to comment on this. But that's actually the fundamental nature of disagreements between us in the democratic opposition and those people who are sitting behind the Kremlin wall. Those people do not believe that Russia is a European country. We do. As Vladimir Solovyov, not the Kremlin propagandist, not to be confused, but the great Russian poet and philosopher from the 19th century once said, the word Russian is an adjective and the noun is European. We are Russian Europeans, just as there are English, German, and French Europeans. I think that is very true. It's important to remember that. And I think we should all not only look forward to, but also actively work to bring closer that day when Russia finally and fully rejoins the European family to which it belongs.
Thank you, Vladimir, for such efficient and effective comments. Last word, Vladimir Milov.
Thank you. Many speakers have been saying a lot about the need to move from words to action and being firm on Putin. I would say one thing. European People's Party group in the European Parliament had a very good picture which they posted on social media saying, "Hit Putin where it hurts, money." And that is very important because I think a pressure campaign on the Russian authorities related to human rights and civil society abuses, I think should be targeted at the members of the Russian elite. Believe me, I know a lot of them because I used to work in the government for 6 years. And I can say that at the moment, great majority of them are extremely unhappy about the course that the country has taken because they have a lot of experience, they know history, and they understand that Russia is heading towards some sort of a catastrophe. No one, like few people in there believe that this course chosen currently by Putin is about to lead Russia to progress. Most think that there will be some sort of turbulent events in the future. So they should be given more signals by Europe that supporting this policy would create a lot of trouble. And particularly oligarchs and dirty money. Thank you, Sergei Guriev, for raising this issue. Believe me, they're not just rich people or corrupt people. They are all the names on the list that we are talking about, Shuvalov, Usmanov, and others. They're also connected big time to specific violation of human rights. I will be happy to contribute to providing dossiers or whatever information is needed. But I think if we speak about moving towards real action, we need to understand that Putin needs something stronger than just statements. And last but not least, I think a key issue at the moment, let me be absolutely frank with you, is some sort of ambiguity on Russia policy, particularly when we speak about the governments of Germany and France. We can read signals on like both sides of the equation. There are some very strong statements or actions. At the same time, we hear this music to Putin's ears that we need to be pragmatic, we need to still cooperate, we cannot exclude Putin and stuff like that. He reads this as weakness. So a bit less ambiguity on part of these biggest EU players, Germany and France, would be very helpful to find a common European approach on how to deal with this regime. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to everyone for taking all this time to discuss this very timely, important issue. And I'm sure we will all get a chance to discuss this, unfortunately, even more frequently. This is all the time we have for this time around. Hopefully we will all talk again soon. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Okay.
Ciao to everybody. Bye.
Thank you.